Hello, this is Cynthia Sue Larson with RealityShifters.com, and today I'm here to talk with you about bridging social rifts with moral psychology. And the thing I'd like to start with today is actually one of the last things that's mentioned in a wonderful book that I've been reading. This is a quote by Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist, and he says, "Happiness comes from between. It comes from getting the right relationships between yourself and others, yourself and your work, and yourself and something larger than yourself." And you may wonder, how does this relate to the kind of social rifts that we all experience? For example, just at any holiday gathering when our family gets together. We don't even have to go that far. You don't need to look at how to get peace in the Middle East, although that would be wonderful. You can look just no farther than your own front door and ask yourself, how do we get along at times when certain subjects come up that people maybe say, don't talk about them, but we know we will? And you may wonder, what am I talking about? Well, of course, the conversations about politics and religion that so often we're tippy-toeing around, pussyfooting around, but actually, when those subjects come up, they can get quite touchy. And why would that be? Well, Jonathan Haidt asks the question in his book, The Righteous Mind. Why do good people get divided by politics and religion? And it's a really good question. One thing that moral psychologists are able to do that I haven't seen done anywhere else, and I've read a lot of books on similar subjects, is to take a look scientifically at what does it take to be a moral person. And you might think it's just a matter of knowing the simple difference between good and bad. And of course it is. But how do you determine the simple difference between good and bad? How do people do that? Why is it that amongst cultures in the world, some people's idea of what's good and bad are so very different than someone else's? Yet overall, the things that help us decide whether something is good or bad are very, very similar. And why is it that liberals and conservatives in times of political elections can get so upset to the point that they have trouble seeing straight, let alone finding common ground, when they really are smart people with good hearts? How can that be? These are the questions that moral psychologists wanted to get some answers to. So by asking really difficult questions that were extremely uncomfortable for the people being asked the questions, these moral psychologists, such as Jonathan Haidt and others, are able to get down to the very basic areas, what you might consider like the 5 taste buds of morality. And what these are that is so interesting is, if I tell you what they are, then you'll get a sense of them. Basically, care versus harm is one of them, fairness versus cheating, liberty versus oppression, loyalty versus betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. So if you're looking at something like this chart that is in the book, which I'm hoping you can see right there, this is looking at those 5, what you might call taste senses, kind of like salty, sweet, sour, bitter, all that stuff. Except these are moral tastes. It's what's called the moral foundation theory. And where you see the intersection here on the far right, this chart happens to be graphing the viewpoints of very, very liberal people on the left to very conservative people on the right. And you can see that conservative people care just as, maybe just a little bit less than liberals, about things like care versus harm and fairness versus cheating, but they do care a whole lot more about loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And so when you start thinking about things in this way, you can begin to bridge this very huge gap that sometimes develops between people who are quite conservative or quite liberal. Another big idea from this book, The Righteous Mind, which I highly recommend reading, especially if you're trying to figure out these differences that people have politically and religiously and pretty much every other way based on morals, then the other big idea is that when people come to a decision about something, like whether they are conservative or liberal, how they feel about a certain contentious subject, they will tend to make decisions first and foremost not on their heads, not their rational thinking. No, it's going to start with their intuitive, emotional body, which often doesn't necessarily know why it's leaning one way or another. But Jonathan Haidt describes it a little bit like a person riding an elephant. The elephant has a tendency to want to go one way or the other. And the person riding the elephant, their rational mind, then comes up with the reasons why this may or may not be a good idea. So if you're wondering, okay, what can I do this holiday season or at the next family gathering to bring peace to a group that seems like it's having a lot of rifts, because it's your family and peace needs to begin at home. Something you can do and think about whenever you're looking at the difference between a couple of groups is to what Jonathan Haidt calls follow the sacredness. And what that means is look for that relationship between someone and something bigger than themselves. And keep an open heart and an open mind when you're looking for this, so that you can better empathize and maybe for the first time get a little glimpse of what's going on with the moral foundations within that group. Maybe they're not only looking at care versus harm and fairness versus cheating, but maybe they're looking at a lot more. And maybe these things matter a great deal to them. By following the sacredness, it makes it easier for all of us to appreciate and truly get what makes somebody else tick, what it is that they're living for that's larger than themselves. So I hope this is helpful for you, and until next time, I'm Cynthia Sue Larson with RealityShifters.com, and asking you to keep asking, how good can it get?